DJ Chuang here, and I'm speaking with Greg Ligon, who's one of the co-authors of two books about the multi-site church that's become a multi-site church movement. The first book, Multi-Site Church Revelation, being one church in many locations, and the second book, a multi-site church road trip, exploring the new normal. And today I wanted to chat with him about the making of a movement and learning about some of the things that he's seen and how this trend and phenomena became a movement over the period of the past, 6 or 10 years? I'll let him tell the story. So, Greg, tell us about how you first got involved with multi-site churches, and when could you tell it becoming something bigger?
Thanks, DJ. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. And it's been a kind of an exciting journey. It was probably a dozen years ago. All of our directors at Leadership Network are constantly networking, hence the name Leadership Network, but we're always in conversation with church leaders and asking them what's working, what's not working, what are their strengths. And probably a dozen years ago, as we were gathered in a team meeting, all of a sudden we realized we had probably 100 churches that in those conversations that we'd had, it indicated that they were doing something with video. And that was really the extent of it at that point in time. On 9/11, we had decided to gather a group of those churches to have a conversation. And during that time, we just heard about the things that they were exploring with reference to the use of video. Really weren't even talking about multi-site at that point in time. We was really talking more about video venue. But it was actually in that initial conversation that we began to say, okay, there's something that's going on here. Shortly thereafter, Leadership made a decision to move to what we call our leadership community model. And my boss, Dave Travis, our CEO, came to me and said, hey, would you be willing to work with these multi-site churches? And to be real honest with you, I thought, you know what, do people really want to come and watch a video? And so I was a little bit skeptical, but I took one for the team and then jumped right in. We actually held our first leadership community meeting in April of 2003 and held that conversation with about a dozen of the peer pioneer churches that you as the names of today. It was really at that point in time that we began to really sense, okay, God's up to something really big here.
Yeah, and what did you notice about, as you gathered these churches for a live, real-time, in-person conversation, what did you notice in terms of their characteristics that they would want to talk with each other, maybe collaborate, and what contributed to something bigger than themselves?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that's actually consistent with any time we gather churches in our leadership communities. They get in the room and they realize, oh, wow, everybody else is still trying to figure this thing out too. So although you've got some of the most advanced leaders in the room, they also come with the spirit of teachability and a willingness to say, hey, we don't have this piece figured out. And you do, and we want that, and we want to help to accelerate our work. And so there's that real sense of collaboration, of community that really happens in those meetings. One of the things that we discovered early on, and one of the things I think is one of the indicators of something that God's trying to do, a movement, is as we had those conversations, that 100 churches that I mentioned early on in our conversation, as we held those conversations, we were hearing people talk about doing multi-site or using video in all different kinds of contexts. So it wasn't one particular geographic area. We were hearing about it in the Midwest and on the West Coast and the southern states, all over the place. We also were hearing about it from a variety of denominations. And although we primarily work with large churches, we were hearing even back in those days years ago about applications of it in smaller congregations as well. And so when you begin to hear those stories and as you talk to those people and they haven't been talking to one another, you realize, okay, this is more of a God thing. This is something that God's really trying to do.
So to summarize, a movement was something you noticed and then you brought the conversation together to see if something more came out of it.
You bet. And when we had that first gathering of the churches, just the richness of the conversation, the vocabulary that got created there. One of the things that I'll not forget is we had a conversation early on with that very first group back in April 2003, and some of the churches, and we've got this guy that kind of is leading this part of our ministry. We thought for a while he was just going to be a really good MC and kind of set up the senior pastor and kind of warm the crowd up, if you would. But we've really realized, no, he really has to be a leader. He's really leading campus and really providing leadership for the staff that's a part of this campus. And one of the churches said, well, we don't know what to call it either, but we started calling that person in our church staff the campus pastor. So that was meeting one in April. When we gathered our second group in November, 6 months later, those churches came in using that vocabulary of campus pastor. And so in a very real way, the language was being created by those first pioneers. And so it was another one of the indicators that we knew, okay, God's up to something big here as well.
And you also captured some of that language and some of those learnings from the early meetings in your first book, Multisite Church Revolution. So you called it a revolution at that point. When did you notice it becoming bigger and something people would describe as a movement? And what happened that triggered that?
One of the first indicators, if you would, I think would be when we launched that second group, and that second group is coming in, already beginning to use some of the language and beginning to have adopted some of the models, that have been promoted and begun to develop by these early churches, the churches that were part of the first group. So that was a part of it. I think then probably the next time that we really began to see, okay, this is God's up to something even really big, was when we released the first book, the Multisite Church Revolution. And that really began to be a conversation piece, if you would, for churches that weren't doing it, as they began to hear the stories of churches that were and begin to explore some of the models that churches were employing. Then we began to see some additional experimentation. We also saw lots of churches that kind of came out of the woodwork, if you would, at that point in time, that were already doing it but weren't aware that anybody else was, because it really hadn't been a part of the public dialogue so much at that point in time. So I guess those are a couple of things. As we moved through our different groups that we'd worked with the Leadership Network, and then when that first book came out were some of the first indicators. We also began to do at that point in time some conferences where we partnered with some of the pioneering churches. We did a conference up at Community Christian. We did a conference out at North Coast and one at Seacoast where we were gathering churches that were doing multi-site and were wanting to do multi-site. That was also probably one of the things that helped to accelerate some of the work at that point in time.
Okay, so there's an acceleration element, and you described three pretty important ingredients, one being the gathering together of the pioneers and helping them to achieve their results and learning from each other. Secondly, the book to capture the language and bring it to public discourse. And then the third, the conferences. And these three big pieces were accelerators that really helped the movement to become what it is.
Yeah, very much so. And, one of the questions that you and I have talked to them about is along the way is, how do leaders create movements? I'm not sure leaders create movements. I think that God creates movements. But I do think that there are very much some things that leaders can do to accelerate movements. And the things you've articulated, kind of recap there are very much a part of that. I think a couple other things that are really important, though, as I look at the leaders that we've worked with, that I think have really helped to accelerate the work of this movement in particular. And one thing I would say is that they're kingdom-focused. Sure, when we get in the room with those guys, they're wanting to figure out how to make it work in their context, and they come with very specific challenges that they're facing or opportunities that are on the rise that they haven't figured a solution for yet. But when it comes down where the rubber meets the road, the bottom line is they're more kingdom focused, and their primary motivator is motivation of evangelism and bringing more people into the kingdom. And so I think that's one of the key accelerators for any movement is if we can get outside of ourselves and our own little part of the world and really be about accelerating the work of the kingdom. I think the other thing that's an important piece is you have to be willing and committed to applying this model in particular, any model associated with any movement, in a way that works in your context. You can't. This isn't a cookie cutter thing. You can't. When you went, the churches that helped accelerate the movement that attended those conferences weren't the ones who went to the conference and sat in a session with Greg Surratt or with Larry or with Dave Ferguson or with any of those guys, and then went home and said, okay, we're going to do it just the Seacoast way. Because if they did it just the Seacoast way or just the North Coast way or just the Community Christian way without seeing how that applied in their context and made the adjustments that were a fit for who they were as a church and the neighborhoods where their campuses were located and the people that God had given them to try to reach, they didn't have much success. But if they were willing to do that work of saying, okay, yeah, we see a piece of what they're doing at Seacoast and some of what is happening in the Midwest, and we're going to put together the model that God's wanting us to implement and to employ here in our context. I think that's where you really begin to see the acceleration happen.
Great. That really helps the viewers that are going to be watching this to get a sense of what are the various ingredients of the movement. And it has to be more than about your own thing. And being kingdom-focused really opens that up. Now, the multi-site movement continues. It's still in motion, and a recent statistic from our colleague Warren Bird came out and said, over 5,000 multi-site churches, while there's only about 1,800 mega churches. So it's still growing. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the indicators is it's continuing to grow. People say, well, you think this thing's slowing down, and nothing that we see is giving us that indication. It used to be this was kind of an anomaly, if you would. Now, I've entered very few conversations with people about church where multi-site doesn't come up as a part of that conversation. Part of that may be because I've been so involved with it over the last 10 years, but even outside of those contexts where I have a conversation with a church leader and they have no idea that I have been involved with multi-site, that still comes up in those conversations. So it's still growing. I think we're going to still continue to see it grow as well. I think that there are several things that are new on the horizon and will continue to grow and to help to accelerate the work. One is this whole idea of mergers. I think that may be the primary growing edge of the multi-site movement as churches look for opportunities to partner with struggling congregations that have been viable at one point in time and want to do something for the kingdom, but just because of the stage of life that they are as a church, they just don't have the resources, whether it's financial resources or leadership resources, to really remain viable in their community. We're seeing churches partner in these mergers that are being born, and I think we'll continue to accelerate the work. Great book by Jim Tomberlin and Warren Bird, the other colleague that was a part of our Multisite Church Revolution and Multisite Church Road Trip books, called Better Together. And it's a great book that talks about the various models of mergers. A couple of other areas I think that are interesting to follow. We're continuing to see some new work in the area of international ministry. We were with a group of churches just back in June, and they are actually here in the States. Their campus is located near a military base, and so one part of their vision, kind of one of their ahas, was, hey, we can be a sending campus for campuses literally around the world, because people will come into their community and they're there for a year or even shorter periods of time being trained, and then are deployed literally all over the world. And so they're looking for ways to develop a model that can be exported to the various places that these soldiers are being sent. So that's kind of a fascinating thing internationally. I think there's also we're going to continue to see some growing work online. Many of the churches we work with now have an internet campus, and you've worked with a lot of those and are following those. It really helped us to track those, DJ. Great work there. But I think that's going to continue to be a growing area of ministry. And I think the thing that's kind of fun for me about that one is not the growth area. I think churches are going to continue to add campuses online, but we're also kind of one of the growing innovative edges is what they're doing with those campuses. So I think we're beginning to see some work beyond just having a worship experience, but what does it look like to have a small group? What does it look like to do student ministry online? And so we're beginning to see some really exciting things happen in that space as well. The last thing that I would say that I think is kind of a really interesting one is this whole area of rural campuses. Met with was introduced to a guy this summer, actually back in the spring, Andy Addis, who's from Kansas, and his church has 10 campuses. And they're in communities that range in size from, I think the largest he told me is like in Hutchinson, Kansas, I think it's like 45,000 people. But they have campuses down in communities as small as a city or a town that when you drive in, the city limit sign would be under 1,000 people. And so they've been able to create this rural model that's really giving viable expressions of the church in some of these really small communities that have just not had that, been able to have that kind of opportunity in many years. So I think that's also a growing edge and one of the things that's really exciting to me. And then I think the last piece is continuing to see some really cool things happening in terms of partnerships. We see one of the churches we reported on back in the early book was still United Methodist Church has a partnership with a YMCA where they're actually doing a campus. One of their campuses is at a YMCA, and they got involved at the early stages and even in the building of that Y, and were able to design that would make it suitable for a worship space as well.
Well, super. Thank you so much for the update on this movement that's continuing progress. And a new Lydia experience was just recently released. Tell us a little bit about what people can get when they download that.
Sure, you bet. Thank you for asking about that. The Leadership Network launched an app just about a year ago that we call Lydia, Leadia. It's a free app. You download the app onto your iPhone or your iPad, and then you can purchase some of these online, we're calling the experiences. It's the tagline for Lydia is read it, watch it, talk about it. So it's short content, 8,000 to 10,000 words. Watching it is lots of media-rich stuff, and then talk about it gives you the ability to interact through your social networks with others who are having those experiences. And we just released one not even a month ago called Multisite the Next Decade. And that one actually we're offering for free and give people an opportunity to experience our app. But the content in that is drawn from a meeting that we held back earlier in the summer with 12 pioneering churches. And we brought them together. They'd all been a part of one of our leadership communities. We brought them back together to explore what's next. We've been at this for 10 years. What's next for the next decade? And so we had some really rich conversations around understanding what the core DNA is, for each of those churches, and understanding what are some of the big aha ideas that they think will shape the future. And so all those experiences, lots of video, lots of opportunity for you to hear engage in conversation with some of those leaders in that Lydia app called Multisite the Next Decade.
Thank you so much, Greg, for being generous and on behalf of the Leadership Network, being a part of this God thing, kingdom kind of movement called Multisite. And I hope this video will be encouragement to other leaders that want to be a part of what God's doing and sharing generously with others and collaborating and learning and just seeing fruit born in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, DJ.
Thank you, Greg.
Your work. It's been fun to partner with you through the years, and you're always on the cutting edge, and I love the things that you're doing. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, Greg.